Spellcasters are a critical part of Baldurs Gate 3 to damage enemies, debuff them, and most importantly, talk to animals. Today we're going to compare the main spellcasting classes to fit a mage role in your party. Let's go! Let me know in the comments which mage class you are running. So what is this mage role that I'm referring to? And it is, like, in some regards a made up term, as in D&D, the mage isn't really a specific thing, but essentially what I'm referring to here is some sort of a spellcaster that can fit into a ranged combat role, especially to damage enemies and debuff them. Now, in Baldurs Gate 3, a ranged damage dealer in this sort of a role is going to be highly beneficial because there is a lot of encounters that have heaps of high ground as well as a lot of distance to cover before you can actually reach the target, and having a ranged spellcaster to damage enemies as well as debuff them and apply effects like that is hugely important. Now, it's also worth mentioning that I won't be covering like the support style here, so your clerics, your paladins, that sort of a thing. We're just talking about like the DPS damage dealing sort of a mage role here. So we're going to talk about the wizard, the warlock, the sorcerer, and the druid. And we'll start with the wizard, as that's like the most, I guess, like, I don't want to say vanilla, but it's like the most vanilla mage casting class, I guess. But essentially the wizards are the master of arcane by specializing in individual schools of magic, combining ancient spells with modern research. Now, in terms of companions, Gale is actually a wizard. So in terms of starting out as a wizard, your primary ability here is intelligence, and intelligence does have a lot of good skills linked to it. So having a wizard in your party with that skill proficiency will definitely see you success, but they typically won't be like your main talker or something like that because they don't have a lot of charisma. They have a very low starting HP compared to some of the other classes, even some of the other mage classes. But some of the unique aspects of the wizard specifically are the arcane recovery. So once per day out of combat, you can replenish your expended spell slots, but for the most part outside of arcane recovery, your spell slots will replenish on a long rest. And they also have access to preparing spells via the spell book. So wizards typically will have the most amount of spells compared to any of the other classes because they can actually learn spells via spell scrolls, but also just because they have a huge amount of like spell pool. Now, you have to actually prepare those spells so you can actually use them in combat. So before any combat encounter or any time that you see fit, you can actually change the spells that the wizard actually has active. So this will give you access to a bunch of different tools that you can use inside and outside of combat. This really gives the wizard a lot more flexibility than some of the other classes and giving them a lot more tools at their disposal because you can have a bunch of spells that can be used for different scenarios and apply them as you see fit. At level 2 as a wizard, you'll pick a school of magic. Now, this will give you additional benefits based on a specific type of magic. In the early access, we only have abjuration and invocation, but all the different schools will be available in the full release. Now, essentially what this does is it allows you to specialize in that specific school of magic. So every spell will say what school of magic it's from, and if you are specialized into that school, you will gain various buffs to those types of spells depending on the specific subclass that you choose. So a wizard will have a huge range of spells available to them. You can specialize in a particular type of spells, whether that be some sort of a damage spell or evocation spells, or you can specialize in other things like conjuration, abjuration, what have you. But there is a lot of flexibility in terms of the wizard's potential because of that high spell pool. The sorcerer, however, doesn't have such a high spell pool, but they can manipulate the spells that they do have to deal different effects. So sorcerers are natural spellcasters inheriting their magic from a gift or a bloodline. Now, this fits a very similar setup to a wizard, but the key difference here, one is that their primary modifier is charisma. So charisma skills are typically all of your conversational skills. So a sorcerer is a good talker for Baldurs Gate 3. They have a very similar starting HP, but you can get a little bit more if you pick the draconic subclass, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But the main difference here is the sorcery points. So essentially what these are is it's a separate resource separate to spell slots that you can use via your meta magic modifiers to add additional effects to the spells that the sorcerer knows. So these effects could be something like allowing you to add multiple targets to a single target spell, or increase the range of a particular spell, or even allow you to cast a spell as a bonus action and then cast another spell as an action based on the meta magic quickened spell. So there are different ways that you can manipulate those spells to sort of benefit you in combat depending on the situation at hand. And that's the key sort of difference between these two classes, is the wizard will have a much wider breadth of spells available to them, whereas a sorcerer can manipulate those spells that they have access to. Now, in terms of subclasses for the sorcerer, you've got wild magic, which gives you advantage on your next attack roll, ability, or saving throw, but it can also trigger wild magic effects that can either help or hinder you in combat. The draconic bloodline is the one that comes with a higher health pool as well as a little bit more armor class, and because you have a draconic bloodline, you get a buff to a specific element or damage type as well. So say if you wanted to focus on like fire magic and choose the draconic bloodline for that, then you'll have additional benefits for that effect. Storm sorcery is also another subclass that isn't available in the early access, but it does help you with your movement in combat as well as give you more benefits to the lightning and like thunder types of magic. The warlock, similar to the sorcerer, doesn't have a huge amount of spells available to them, but they do have benefits in other regards. So the warlock has 10 starting HP, which is more than some of the other classes, and they're a very flexible class because they can also use simple weapons, spells, and have access to some unique cantrips as well. So the primary modifier for a warlock is charisma, same as the sorcerer, which is also beneficial, say if you wanted to multi-class with a sorcerer and a warlock, but they have warlock spell slots. Now these recharge on a short rest compared to sorcerers and warlocks that recharge on long rest. And they can also have the service of a familiar, so they can summon like little companions to either help them in combat or do various things for them. But speaking of those cantrips, the main one that you really want to think about as a warlock is Eldritch Blast. Now this is an amazing cantrip that does 1 to 10 force damage on its own, but it can be upgraded as you level up to add additional effects like knockbacking enemies or additional charges, those sort of things. Now because this is a cantrip, you can cast this literally every turn with no downside because it doesn't consume a spell slot. So it's the main benefit to a warlock, and they can fit sort of a bit more of a battle mage setup because of their proficiencies to simple weapons and allowing them to like hold swords, but then also have access to these sort of a cantrips and spells. Now in terms of a subclass here, the options for the warlock, you're either going to pick Fiend, which will allow you to heal when you defeat enemies. It also gives you access to some slightly more damage focused spells. The Great Old One will, when you land a critical hit against a creature, the creature or nearby enemies are frightened until the end of the turn. And the Archfey gives you Fey Presence, so you can charm or frighten enemies until the end of your next turn. The Druid is the next one before we start comparing these classes, but the Druid channels the elemental forces of nature and share a deep kinship with animals. The Druid is a bit more of a support focused class, but I wanted to include it in this video because you can play it as that sort of a mage setup, especially as a Circle of the Land subclass, which if you are playing it in this way, you're definitely playing it as Circle of the Land because you get natural recovery. So once per day out of combat, you can replenish expended spell slots, which then allow you to cast your spells again. So there's a lot more benefits to that, but you'll probably be playing it as that subclass. But specifically what makes the Druid special here is they do have a little bit more starting health. Their primary ability modifier is Wisdom, but they also have access to Wild Shape. That's the most unique part of their kit. So essentially Wild Shape allows you to transform into some sort of an animal. Now this can be for combat reasons, say for the bear to allow you to attack with a higher armor class and higher health pool and attack in sort of a melee range, or even outside of combat to do some sneaky things, say either as a cat or a badger that allows you to like dig underground and pop out at different locations. So there's a lot of flexibility with the Druid because of the Wild Shape option, and I fully expect that because of the sandbox that Baldurs Gate 3 is, there will be reasons to have a wild shape ability to do various things and try and complete tasks in different ways compared to some of the other classes. So it's just something to think about if you are thinking about picking up the Druid. But we've already talked about subclass here. It's really only Circle of the Land if you wanted to focus on the sort of mage aspects of the Druid kit and stay in your human form for spellcasting, whereas Circle of the Moon is a combat wild shape focused sort of subclass where you can transform into your wild shape as a bonus action during combat, and you also get access to different wild shapes compared to the other subclasses. And Circle of the Spores is sort of like a necromancy themed subclass, which you could potentially pick, but I'm sort of focusing on the Circle of the Land for this. So comparing these mage classes, right? Now we've sort of broken down the specific uniqueness for each of these classes, but there are things that are similar, right? And that comes down to proficiencies, saving throws, your spell slots and cantrips, and your overall how they restore those spell slots themselves. We'll start with proficiencies. As a wizard and a sorcerer, you don't have any armor proficiencies at all, so you can't wear armor. You can only wear robes. You can avoid this a little bit by casting mage armor on yourself to increase your armor class, but you will have a low amount of health pool and no armor proficiency, so you'll have a low armor class and will expect to take a fair chunk of damage if you do actually get hit. Whereas a warlock has light armor proficiency. They also have simple weaponry, so you can use some sort of, swords or different other simple weapons, so you can be that sort of a battle mage archetype. And the druids have even more, having light and medium armor proficiencies, as well as shield and simple. So you've got much more flexibility as a druid if you want to play it in different ways, especially if you wanted to use, say, their cantrip Shillelagh to imbue some sort of a weapon in terms of a melee combat way that you wanted to build out that druid. So there's potential there for the warlock and druid to fill multiple roles with a bit more flexibility in combat, whereas a wizard and a sorcerer specifically are really just filling that range spellcasting role. In terms of your saving throws, as a wizard, you've got intelligence and wisdom. A warlock has wisdom and charisma. The druid has wisdom and charisma as well. And the sorcerer is the main one here to think about, as a sorcerer has concentration and charisma. Saving throws are used in combat to see if you pass or fail various checks to apply effects to your characters. But the main one here, constitution, that the sorcerer has is the important one. So any spell that you cast that requires a concentration of your character will use your constitution saving throw anytime you get hit to determine whether you keep that concentration or lose it. Because the sorcerer has this saving throw, they add their proficiency bonus to any constitution saving throws that they have to pass, so you have a higher chance of keeping that concentration compared to the other mage type classes. For spell slots and cantrips, at creation, the wizard has 3 cantrips and 6 spells that they can learn, but they can obviously learn more, as we've already talked about. The warlock has 2 cantrips and 2 spells, the sorcerer has 4 cantrips and 2 spells, and the druid has 2 cantrips and 4 spells. Now, in terms of the spell slots themselves, a wizard and sorcerer have the most amount of actual spell slots that they can use, but they do have to use the long rest in order to restore them. The warlock only has 2 spell slots at level 5, but the benefit here is that they can actually regain their spell slots on a short rest. So technically they have 6 slots before they have to long rest, whereas wizards and sorcerers have to long rest to get that actual restoration of their spell slots. The druid here can regain some spell slots out of combat, as we've already talked about, but they also have a solid amount of actual spell slots compared to the others as well. There is a lot of options in this sort of spell casting role, and a lot of the other classes that aren't necessarily mage classes have subclasses that allow them to specialize in some sorts of magic to gain various spells. Something like the Eldritch Knight Fighter, or the Wild Magic Barbarian, the Arcane Trickster Rogue, or even the Ranger, or the more support focused classes like the Bard, the Cleric, and the Paladin, which we'll discuss in a separate video. But you've got a lot of options to fill this role in Baldur's Gate 3 if you choose to fill it. You don't have to, depending on how you want to build out your party. That's up to you. But I want to break down these different roles to help people decide on which characters they should not only bring with them, but who they should play as and how the parties sort of fit together. So let me know what you're using as your sort of mage spellcasting class in the comments down below. Thank you guys for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is Norza, and I hope you have a great day.